when my brother-in-law was diagnosed, there was really no information, no publications on what the molecular drivers of cholangiocarcinoma were. Now we not only know what those drivers are, but there are multiple FDA-approved drugs targeting them. But that was a long road of, many people funding basic research to identify those drivers, study them, have drug companies pick that up, see an opportunity, and then see it finally make it to market.
Hello, and welcome to Cancer Rebranded. I'm Craig Lustig. In this episode, we're going to focus on rare cancers. These are the stepchildren of cancer. They get fewer dollars for research. Patients may have more limited treatment options, and the challenges for advocates to raise awareness and build support can be really daunting. Let's talk about the unique experience of people with rare cancers and the advocates who support them. For this episode, I'm joined by Jim Palma and John Hopper. Jim and John are both colleagues and friends and are both leaders in the rare cancer community, leading research and advocacy efforts and bringing focus on improving outcomes for this underserved group of patients. So good morning, John and Jim. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for joining me for this discussion around rare cancers, which I think maybe until I had a rare cancer, I had no clue about what the heck that meant. And so we're gonna, talk about all of that. And I think there were some really interesting issues that are unique to the community of people who are impacted by rare cancers, and I think that's important, and we'll drill down into that a bit. So, but maybe it's just a starting point. Can we talk a little bit about what defines a rare cancer? So let's see. So I looked up the NCI, the National Cancer Institute information, and it said that in the US, I guess, if it's 40,000 new cases annually or less, constitutes a rare cancer. Okay. And so, and then sort of spinning out from there, if you look at childhood cancers, pediatric cancers, which is defined by the NCI as cancers in people under the age of 15 diagnosed, the total for that is not even 11,000. So as a group, pediatric cancers are rare. If you look at young adults, interestingly, that number, which has gone up, is and that's again defined as diagnosed between 15 and 49. That is 80,000 young adults diagnosed with cancer. But if you look at the annual number of cancer cases diagnosed overall, it's 1.9 million in the U.S. So all of these numbers really, are overwhelmed by this much larger group, and we know that there are, the big cancers, and they get a lot of attention and a lot of money, and so maybe what we should do is start out by talking a little bit about kind of, you both have been in this world for a while and are really passionate about it and bring a lot of expertise to it. And I would say, by many measures, have been very successful. So, but let's talk a little bit about what drives your passion. How did you kind of step through this door? So, Tim, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Craig. And just back to your question about what defines a rare cancer, I think that in my experience, the advocacy community has sort of united a little bit more around this number of 6 per 100,000, which is about 20,000 cases per year. So sort of drilling down a little bit further than that NCI definition. But I think that what in certainly for our organization, the number is a big part of it, but the other part of it kind of speaks to some of the challenges of rare cancers that we'll probably talk a little more about. So, does the cancer, is there a defined research program or dedicated labs looking into the rare cancer? Are there established or FDA approved treatments? Are there clinical trials? So often the answer to those questions is no. So that sort of all rolls up along with a number to what, in my opinion, at least, defines a rare cancer, more so than just the number alone. So just wanted to mention that in response to your first question. But as far as I'm concerned, and why I'm a part of this community, certainly, like many people in the advocacy world, certainly the rare disease advocacy world. It wasn't part of my plan, but a personal experience brought me into this. So my brother-in-law, Paul, was diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma when he was in his late 30s. And his experience really, is the same, unfortunately, as so many other patients with rare cancers, certainly in 2009 and still today, and in a lot of ways, of just a lack of information and a really shocking lack of available treatments for the type of cancer, despite being at a top medical center in Boston. So he started the foundation himself while he was being treated. After he passed away, his wife, who's my sister, decided to keep the foundation going. And about a year later, I left my previous job sort of in the financial world and came over to start doing this work. And I've been doing it ever since. So that's how I got here, sort of a path that wasn't really laid out, but one I found myself in, and has led to over a decade of this work.
And I think you make an interesting point, which is that because of in many of these diseases, the lack of useful treatments, the lack of trials and things like that, my experience has been that there are just, when the people who are active and are passionate often are not the patients. And that's, I think, important to recognize, because we lose a lot of those patients. And so the work then falls to folks like you to really carry that forward. And I think it creates a somewhat of a different dynamic in how the advocacy happens and all of that, but we can talk more about that. So,
yeah.
Sean, do you want to give us a little preview on how you got here?
Absolutely, Craig. First of all, I can say, with Jim's, kind of caveats on the numbers, I totally agree with him in terms of, it's probably even lower than that. And I think we've also find that even internationally, what Europe thinks is a rare cancer is a little bit different than what we're defining it to. So there's really not even a universal, agreement on what a rare cancer is. And maybe that's one of the challenges we all have to do at some point. But, why did I get into this area? I was a dropout pre-med in college and went into industry for most of my life, and, decided that healthcare was an interesting area to get into, started working with certain foundations, and then voila, in the middle of that, my nephew, at the age of 2, came down with medulloblastoma, stage 4. They basically told my sister, who I'm very close to, that he had 2 weeks to live, to get everything's in order and to bring him home to die. He's 28 now. So that's the good news on it. But watching her go through that and the whole family rallying around and realizing that, pediatric brain cancer is one of those areas, again, that has so much information that's not there, so many studies that are not there, and has no curative therapies for the most part. At the same time, my dad came down with pancreatic cancer, which at the time would have been considered a rare cancer because it's about 46,000 incidents a year. People think it's larger. And I believe at the time, the rare cancers were defined at a higher number. So I had pancreatic cancer. My dad, his brother then came down with it. So I had 2 pancreatic cancers in my immediate family, medulloblastoma, and I had, unfortunately, some aunts who also had some rare cancer. So where did that bring me? Eventually, I decided to change careers, and a family in Greenwich approached me who had a son who had something called fibrolamellar. As they defined it to me, he was 27 years old. He was basically diagnosed when he was 26. 18 months later, he died. And this family came from great wealth, and they realized that money could not buy a cure for a cancer that people couldn't even pronounce, let alone, find a cure or any place. So that touched my heart because it reminded me of the journey that my dad went through with pancreatic. It reminded me of the journey that my nephew did with medulloblastoma, better outcome on that case. But I decided that this was a calling for me, and I left industry to kind of start to run the Fibrolamellar Cancer Foundation. And I would say that, as Jim was saying, I think the passion behind it is I think we all feel we can help to find that cure, that we can bring a community together that perhaps doesn't exist in rare cancers, that we realize probably from our background, Jim comes from industry, I come from industry, that, networking and collaboration and all those things there are so important. I think what we found is that, that didn't exist 10 years ago, collaboration in particular, and it is now. I'd say the last thing, Craig, is in terms of a passion, and Jim's actually part of this, my kids and I, because of the journey we went through with my nephew, started our own family foundation called the Hopper Belmont Foundation. And we actually give grants to early career investigators that are looking at rare cancers and trying to give them a start by having them, be designated and say, hey, you won an award. Now you can use this to get larger awards along that way. So there's a passion that continues on even with the next generation of my kids too.
I think you make some really interesting points, John, in particular around sort of how the research dollars flow, right? There's a lot more sort of small organizations in this space. And something that, at least, if there's some good news here, I think it's important to talk a little bit about in pediatric cancers, where we said in total, right, this is about 10,500 cases a year, but it is a field, with some exceptions, like some of the pediatric brain tumors, where there's been enormous success, to the point that in particularly in some of the blood cancers, the leukemias, where we're able to cure most of those kids with those diseases, right? So let's talk a little bit about, why that is, and the kind of dynamics that have led to, at least in this one pocket, if you will, of cancer research, led to just so much. The outcomes are extraordinary, and they've been working with, kind of fewer dollars and no new drugs and things like that. So, my experience working in that space is that, first of all, almost every child who's diagnosed with cancer is treated at a big center, right? And they're often treated on a clinical trial. And we know that that's in comparison to what in the adult setting, it's 3 or 4% on a clinical trial, right? So, first of all, you have a setting where they have a clinical trial. They're, as I said, often treated in a big center, so they're getting a much more sort of multidisciplinary team caring for them. Most of these children are not treated in the community setting. That's not to, if you'll, just the community setting, but it's to say that just simply aren't the resources there. So, and maybe the other part, at least in my observation over the years, is that, and John, you may have some thoughts about this from your own family's experience, is that when there's a child in the family with cancer, everyone in that family, in that community, tends to sort of really rally around, and that makes a difference, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, kind of backing up a little bit to the areas that you both work in, what do you talk a little bit about that research environment? So in fibromyalgia, how have you been able to, right? And we all know, for better or for worse, in this country, cancer care is about money, like so many other things in our lives, right? So, if a drug company doesn't see the ability to make a profit on a new therapy, they're not going to invest in it. And we know that creating new cancer therapies is wildly expensive. So they're not going to go down that road to create for fibromyalgia, or for that matter, cholangiocarcinoma. So, many years ago when I was treated, I was on a clinical trial, but it was with old drugs, as they called them, right? All the stuff that had been approved was on the shelf, had been already on the shelf for 20 years. And all they were trying to do, in my case, was to, I obviously, with the brain tumor diagnosis, standard of care was you're gonna have surgery, and then we can irradiate your brain. Well, I wasn't such a smart guy to start with, and if they were going to irradiate my brain after surgery, I would have been left with a lot of deficits. So the trial I went into was creatively trying to say, how do we simply use chemotherapy drugs, which are pretty toxic, but we know can be effective in treating this tumor type, and in theory, avoid the use of radiation. So talk a little bit about, from your experience, how the research paradigm, if you will, is different.
Jim, you want to go first?
Sure. So I think in rare cancers, the research environment can be incredibly challenging, and there's a lot of reasons for that. it's really hard to get funded to study a rare cancer. There's a catch-22. In order to succeed in securing NCI or government funding, you need a basic set of data, of tools, and those kinds of things. But without NCI funding, it's really hard to develop those tools.
Right.
And for a young researcher, and this speaks to the importance of what John's Family Foundation is doing, for a young researcher, kind of staring down a career of these challenges in getting funded and running a lab and having other people interested, it makes a lot of sense why somebody might lean towards a type of cancer where those challenges just don't exist. But that really does leave a gap for so many rare cancers, and that's why the treatment option, one of the reasons why the treatment options are so limited. I do think it's a place, though, and this is certainly something I think John and I have seen firsthand over the years, where philanthropy can really play a critical role. So for those younger researchers, for the labs that are, kind of deciding what direction that they want to go in, if we as organizations can provide that initial funding, the seed funding to get things going, it can really fill that gap to help them get to the point where maybe they can then apply for NCI funding and can secure the larger grants, which allows them to really build a comprehensive research program. So, for you were talking about all of these organizations that are started by family members. And that's the community we operate in. Almost everybody I know works at an organization, where there is a connection, where it was started in that way. We have a really important role to play to define those gaps and hopefully in a very targeted and effective way provide funding that helps to build those programs that then grow into something else and something much larger. So, I think what's exciting about having been doing this for long enough is being able to see this play out over a decade. And certainly cholangiocarcinoma is a place where, while the disease remains incredibly challenging, when my brother-in-law was diagnosed, there was really no information, no publications on what the molecular drivers of cholangiocarcinoma were. Now we not only know what those drivers are, but there are multiple FDA-approved drugs targeting them. But that was a long road of many people funding basic research to identify those drivers, study them, have drug companies pick that up, see an opportunity, and then see it finally make it to market. So it does take a long time, but you can see where that is. And now I think that perspective allows all of us to think about how do you accelerate that timeline and how do you do better. So it's not 10 years. It's much less than that. So,
sure. And maybe just to follow up, and then John, we'll go to you. But so my dad's gone 10 years, cholangiocarcinoma, and I entirely agree with what you're saying, which was at the time we knew very little. And he was literally, from the point he was diagnosed till his passing, was 1 month. And that's not an uncommon story in that disease, right? And so and as you said, the exciting part is the science has moved so rapidly in diseases like this. So is part of it, what are the reasons for that? Is it simply that we have lots of new technology and we're able to do things like the molecular profiling, really understand the drivers of the disease? Is it an attitudinal thing? Where is industry or NCI around sort of their interest in these rare cancers?
I mean, I think a lot of it has to do, there's many reasons, but the one that I tend to think about the most is sort of a better understanding of molecular drivers of cancer, and also sort of a little more of a tumor agnostic approach to developing drugs, getting them approved and getting them to patients. So, in cholangiocarcinoma, the standard of care chemotherapy still exists, but for people who have certain genomic drivers, there are different opportunities for them now. So that's and many of those drivers actually are not limited to cholangiocarcinoma. They're actually present in other cancers as well. So that allows a drug company to see an opportunity beyond one rare cancer and maybe to multiple cancers, which I think can help to drive development of that drug. But on the sort of tumor agnostic side, when you look at immunotherapy and the opportunities there, we've seen approvals not for cholangiocarcinoma or for solely one or two types of cancer, but for any cancer who has a certain genomic signature. So those advances, I think, are allowing the rare cancer community to benefit from drugs
Absolutely.
that may be developed more in a way for larger cancer populations. And that to me really brings a lot of excitement. It also brings a lot of challenge, which is, the other side of that, but it is where I hope we can continue to really keep this momentum moving forward.
Yeah, if we can leverage that, I think that's a really, really valuable point. And in theory might be the solution to a lot of these rare cancers.
Yeah.
So John, give us your perspective in terms of, the research or the scientific environment, where is it at, where was it, how has it changed, things
Sure.
like that.
Yeah, so fibrolamellar, is an adolescent young adult cancer. And, one of the key things, we don't even know what the incidence of it. And I think that's a basic issue with research too. I mean, if you look at the NCI SEER study, they say it's 60 per year, and like I can count 100 on my hand. So, of new instances.
Right.
So, so a lot of the rare cancer foundations got to find other ways to look at it. And we've been looking at other data through other organizations. So we're probably more like 1,000, still very rare. But that's an issue when you try to get motivating a researcher or a pharmaceutical company, et cetera. So you start off with, what's the population size? If you don't know it, that's an issue. That's an issue also trying to get, as Jim said, NIH grants, and things like that. You've got to have more of the data. One of the things I will say is that with fibrolamellar, there are no standard of care or curative therapies right now. But to Jim's point, genomics has played a huge role. And one of the first areas that we funded was an organization at Rockefeller who actually did genomic profiling and found out that in fibrolamellar, there is one common mutation in every one of these young people. Again, remember, there's very few, other mutations in the body at that age there too. And then later on, we found out that it's the driver mutation. That was a big aha moment.
Sure.
That's the genomic profiling one. So that gave researchers something to target and to start looking at different drugs or different approaches or the different pathways and all that good stuff there. But I think the other key thing is, besides that, we're still far away from finding, again, a standard of care for this. But I would say the other part that's occurred over the last, 8 to 10 years, and I'm going to give Jim, a kudos for this, because when I came on board, Craig, nobody knew anything about fibrolamellar, and we were funding 3 different institutions that were going no place. I'm like, what do I do to try to help to move this along? And you try to find other cancers that, quite frankly, are in the same part of the body, close to it.
Sure.
GI cancers, like thanks to you, Craig, with the GI Cancer Alliance, et cetera. But Jim was one of the first ones I reached out to. So like, well, cholangiocarcinoma, the bile duct, the pancreas, the liver all start with the same primitive stem cells. And so maybe we can find ways to work together. And we're all starting to work that way to say, hey, Jim, who are you working with? Stacy Lindsay, who are you working with? And we found out that a lot of those researchers actually could work on fibrolamellar, or in fact, had started to, but didn't have enough funding for it. So you find that this network that we're beginning to build on the research end has really been fantastic, because we have some of the same great researchers working on similar rare cancer. So they now have the smarts of, what's a rare cancer, what's a rare GI cancer, what's cholangio doing that might be effective for fibrolamellar, that pancreatic might be doing. So that network didn't exist before. And we're also starting to get other groups like the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, right? So the Zuckerbergs now look at rare diseases as being a key area, and rare cancers is a big part of that. But they also believe that the patient voice is huge. How do you get patients more involved? And that's everything from, starting a biobank. Like that's, some of the basics of the NCI was, what's one of the issues that research? There's no biospecimen.
There's no tissue, right? Yeah.
So getting patients to be driven more to be activating them, not just engaging them, but activating them so that they can be part of the solution, getting them into clinical trials, as you said, talking to the FDA, so all those things are a momentum to build on what Jim was saying, to say, and that's where drug companies start to pay attention, more early career researchers begin to pay attention, and this collaborative community, I would say, and looking at things like genomics, put the two together, and all of a sudden you have a lot of more optimism in there.
Yeah. This is a great segue, because I'd love to spend a little time talking about that patient experience. And kind of a few things come to mind. We know that I think for a lot of rare cancers, because the clinicians don't see them very much, right? It means that unless you're at a big center, so you may end up with a delayed diagnosis, which could, in theory, obviously change your outcome significantly. And I think that you make an interesting point about this idea of how, at least on the research side, you're looking to researchers that are working in, parts of the body that may have a relationship. So do you see patients doing any of that? And I'll give you my example. So I was treated after surgery, 6 months of outpatient chemotherapy, and it's a very small trial. I don't know, I think it's about 300 patients a year, and this type of brain tumor called germ cell tumor. And 10 months later, I had a recurrence. And there's no internet to look up things. This is, of course, the dark ages. But a very good friend who was actually an infectious disease physician, he had been in the background doing all sorts of research for me. And so there's no standard of care, because I'm not going to go now and get my whole brain radiation, because that's really what I've been trying to avoid all along. And Memorial Sloan Kettering, where I was being treated, was, if you will, taking their best guess and saying, well, we need to move to new chemotherapy, and then we're going to give you a low dose of radiation. And so what did we do? My friend said to me, he said, reminded me that I had what they called a midline tumor, pituitary gland, pineal gland, right? What is that related to? If you go down the midline, testicular cancer. So we went, and I, think that it reminds me every day that people who have resources and connections always do better. It's, sadly. So my friend said, we're going to go talk to one of the docs that treated Lance Armstrong, because your tumor type has a relationship with testicular cancer. And we flew to Indianapolis, and we met with one of those docs, and we said to him, like, here's what they're proposing back at Sloan Kettering. What do you think? But that is, I think the journey for people with rare cancers is just so much more complex, because the resources and the expertise is just so much more rare, if you will, right? So, how to your point, John, like, how do patients, effectively get activated when, and now obviously now we have access to resources that we didn't have when I was diagnosed, 30 years ago. How are patients using information to better inform, educate themselves, and then become more activated and active in the, seeking out the best treatment for them and things like that?
Yeah. I'll start maybe, and I'm sure Jim has a lot to add to it. So, it's a whole new world, I think, Craig, in the last, again, 10 years or so in terms of patients. Number one is, they seek out others like them, right? Which is so tough in rare cancers, right? It's like, you don't go down the street and have somebody waving another pink ribbon along the way. How do you find them? And, the good part, there's a double-edged sword with social media, right? The good part is there's a lot of Facebook groups, and other support groups that you can find online. But I do think that those are effective in terms of saying, how do we work together? What's the need out there, et cetera? The other downside, of course, is they become Google doctors and you lead people astray. But sure, to your question about, patient activation, et cetera, I think, there's a couple of things. One is for example, the Department of Defense now has a whole rare cancer segment that they're doing in terms of funding. And that's a little bit of a combination of what's happened through the GI Cancer Alliance, through Nor's Rare Cancer Coalition, through the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, through other groups that have started to look at, the importance of rare cancers. And again, almost every case, the patient's a key part of that. The FDA now has this whole patient, engagement collaborative, or whatever they call it, but they are recognizing that patients are important. So they're reaching out, or they're going to organizations like, Jim's or mine, to say, how do I find those patients? How do I put them on a panel? And I think basically showcasing what patients as their testimonials in terms of their journey has really awakened quite a bit in terms of industry, government, et cetera. So long and the short of it is, how do patients get activated? A part of it is through the peer group type of social media that they have. The other part is now you've got government starting to encourage that. But I think the core, quite frankly, is foundations like, like what we're representing here, where the patients is the heart. At the end of the day, we're looking to cure those patients and we'd like to be out of business. So how do we motivate them and get them activated along the way? So to me, the core is a combination of what we actually start to initiate and then seeing the ripple effect on positive with government, other large foundations, and even, quite frankly, at the hospital level. Jim?
Yeah, that's incredibly well put. I completely agree. I think the only thing I would add to that is to say there's a level of necessity, unfortunately, in rare cancers for patients to really become advocates, and in so many cases become experts on their disease. I'm amazed. I'm not surprised, but I'm amazed constantly at just how incredibly scientifically sophisticated people become when they're facing a rare cancer where there's so little information. And I think, fortunately, in many more common cancers, not that they're any less difficult or anything like that, but there is a good established set of literature. There's a good plan in place. So even if you're at, a hospital, maybe a less comprehensive cancer center, there may be a really very well tested, established treatment plan for the type of cancer that you have. There may be multiple treatment plans for that type of cancer. That's not the case with rare cancers. So, patients learn about the mutations that are present. They learn about the importance of genomic profiling. They do connect with groups like John was saying, or organizations like ours, to learn about where to go, who are the right doctors. So I do think that, in any cancer, people need to learn and they need to advocate for themselves. But in so many cases, we not only advise patients to do this, but they're doing it on their own anyway. They're bringing information to their doctors. They're asking incredibly smart and important questions. And in many cases, just like like you described, Craig, taking action to follow an idea or follow a pathway towards what may be an effective treatment. So it comes from necessity in a lot of ways, but it's something that the community can really support, both the community of other patients and caregivers, but also the community of advocacy organizations who, where that's what we're really here to do in so many ways.
So since you ended with, a mention of the advocacy community, let's talk a little bit about, we know that there are in the cancer community, there are lots of coalitions where whether that's just the advocacy organizations or in some cases industry, or whether it's cancer centers, but there are these joining together of groups, large and small, to focus on a variety of things, whether that's education that they want to do among themselves to on a topic that they're all interested in, or maybe it's more specifically around public policy and thinking like that. So but I do think, in my experience, and I'd love to hear your perspectives on this, which is that the idea of a coalition, a group of organizations coming together and having a shared agenda is actually can be just much more powerful in the end in the rare cancer world. I think, from my perspective, if nothing else, it's because it just elevates their voice in a way that they maybe just couldn't independently. So can each of you talk a little bit about the coalition experience, if you will, and the goods and the bads, and kind of what you think you've been able to derive from it for the patients that you kind of represent and serve?
Sure, you want to start, John?
Sure. So, the coalition concept has really, I think, taken off in a positive way. So I'll talk about the positives first. I'll talk about some of the challenges that. So I think the positives, you kind of hit on, Craig. One is, we can learn from each other. When you're rare, obviously it's lonely, both not only from the patient standpoint, but from the foundation standpoint, the researcher standpoint. Like, who else cares about what this, what we're doing?
Right.
So the coalition brings in a lot of those people who say, who cares, together, so we do care. And where do we care? We care everything from patient support and, the whole mental, philosophy of, what are they going through, et cetera, through the loneliness of it, et cetera. And how do we help to address that with some common types of approaches to the research end, as we talked about before. Again, my experience has been, even before coalition started, is finding like groups like Jim's and Stacy's, et cetera, who are willing, very willing, to share learnings along the way, because they know eventually, hopefully, I can do the same thing. It can be a quid pro quo. That's not the reason you do it, but certainly find that to be certainly very important along the way. Then you go to the aspect of the coalition voice with government, right? Social Security Administration, are they giving enough of this, money out to those patients who need it? Government policies, et cetera, getting U.S. senators, and things like that to get behind it. Like, we started Rare Cancer Day, Jim and I, as part of the Rare Cancer Coalition, but we have, government officials now kind of getting behind that, because it's a group of rare cancers, not just fibromedullary or cholangiocarcinoma. So that voice becomes extremely important from that standpoint. And I would say, again, the other plus of the coalitions is, as I mentioned before, you get the Department of Defense, you get the FDA, et cetera, to want to talk about rare cancers as a group now, as opposed to individuals. So I think huge benefit from that perspective. So from research, from government, from, all the key stakeholders along the way. The challenge often is that, rare cancer, foundations, we're leanly staffed. I've got 3 people, Jim's got about the same along the way. We have so much going on that, when a coalition wants to pick your brain center, it sometimes becomes, secondary in terms of priority, because you've got other things going on. So, I think this is where larger money coming in to fund, quite frankly, a group that actually can lead this, as opposed to people just volunteering their time, would be very helpful. I'd say that's, to me, one of the key downsides. Is it's a great idea, but often we don't have the time to pursue it.
I think that's really important. And I neglected to note that the 2 of you are the co-chairs of the Rare Cancers Coalition within NORD, which is the National Organization for Rare Diseases. So, you're really in the trenches doing this, and I'm sure it could be 2 day jobs to be doing that work, and nobody's paying you extra money to do that, and you're still trying to maintain everything you're doing inside your individual organizations. And I know from my experience, for a number of years, I was co-chair of something called the Alliance for Childhood Cancer, which was a really interesting and I thought very productive coalition of groups interested in childhood cancer. But the way we were structured, because again, it's a very different model, where the clinicians and researchers and the families are really all at the same table just from the outset, right? Because that's how it works. Our co-chairs were somebody representing, if you will, the patient advocacy side of the house, and then we had somebody coming from one of the academic centers, whether that was a pediatric oncologist or a pediatric oncology nurse or a social worker, things like that. And so, these coalitions can be very productive, but boy, they are very hard when you're running a small shop that's lean and mean. So Jim, what other kind of thoughts do you have on this? And I think there's certainly positives, but let's talk about the challenges too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the biggest challenge is doing all the things that we want to do with something like the Rare Cancer Coalition. And fortunately, in our case, because it's a NORD organization, we do have that support from NORD to run it. And without that, it would be very hard to do. But I think at the end of the day, every rare cancer is a little bit different, but really the challenges that rare cancer patients face are very consistent. So when you have a coalition, you do have a way, like John said, to share information, to share learnings, to sort of aggregate ideas and best practices. Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges in the rare cancer, rare disease space is that in so many cases, when a family is impacted by a rare disease, one of the things that many people do is they're inspired to start an organization. One of the challenges in that, though, is that sometimes then you have multiple organizations in a disease that affects very, very few people. And at best, those organizations work together. And obviously, in other cases, that doesn't happen. And sometimes, there can be some difficulties or competition there. So I think one of the other things that the coalition can do is really help unify organizations, even if they are somewhat in the same space or very directly in the same space. And I think what we tried to do is really help to kind of promote the idea of figuring out, what do we all do? There can be multiple organizations in one space. And I think they can work together when they really understand what are their different areas of focus and how does their work complement each other rather than working in competition. And I think as a coalition, by allowing people opportunities to get together and talk and share ideas, it helps to promote more of that. Or at least certainly that's what we're trying to do. So, I guess it's a challenge and hopefully somewhat of a solution that we can help to provide by sort of unifying people rather than having everybody operating separately. But yeah, that's one of the things that's very important, certainly to me, and I know John as well.
And I think you make a really important point, because it's one thing, let's say, when you have something like the GI Cancers Alliance, which we're all part of, because that has big and small groups, and it has industry at the table, and it has, again, sort of academic medical center. And so maybe the upside there is that it sort of dilutes things enough so that there wouldn't be the same amount of sort of infighting, if you will, if it was all just a bunch of small groups at the table. The flip side is it's everyone, the smaller groups are also going me, and how do I, make sure that I'm getting my time in the sun and we're paying attention as a collaboration to the needs of that patient population as well. But it's tricky. It absolutely is tricky. And I think, going back to what I was saying, where at least, let's say, I know from my experience in the brain tumor community, where you had a lot of folks who, with the leadership, were coming to it with great passion because they had lost somebody. It can be harder, I think, to put your individual agenda, your organization's agenda aside when you come to that coalition, and truly, find that comfort level and collaboration. And maybe, John, to your point about, like, most of these groups, right, they are really small, right? So they're just making payroll every couple of weeks. So you're fighting for your organization's life. You're trying to raise all the money, and there's all these demands on you to be, to take on another half-time job, being at the table for this coalition. So there's a lot of pressures, and I actually, that might be an interesting space for us to spend a couple of minutes. Like, what do you think are both the, if you will, the joys and challenges, if you will, of being part of a really small organization? And certainly I was as well in the childhood cancer world, but talk, maybe, Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess, I think about it a lot, but rarely have a chance to really talk about it. I think there are a lot of amazing things about being a part of an organization like this, being so connected to, still, 13 years later, to our founder, not only because he was a family member, but also because I think he really started something really amazing and was very forward thinking. And by being a part of this over these years, being a part of a small organization really allows you to be nimble and follow ideas. And I think in this world, that's really important, whether we're being very strategic and kind of operating on the fly with research funding, and really following progress and trying to do something impactful, or, as we've done, developing a clinical study that responds to the challenges that we're hearing about. We're able to do this in a way that we have control over and that we can push forward very quickly if we want to. Of course, on the other side of that, though, is, when you work for a small organization, and certainly when you run one, you wear every hat, all of them, all the time. We don't have an HR department. We don't have a payroll department. We don't have many, many things, and anybody on the Target Cancer team certainly is pretty much doing everything. We're trying to grow beyond that and think about strategic ways to do that. But there is a big change, I think, that occurs for organizations when they move from that smaller setting to a more expansive kind of corporate nonprofit setting. And that can present challenges in a lot of ways, not the least of which being just an incredibly a large workload all the time, and never really leaving your work behind. But in some ways, that's what makes it exciting as well. So, John, I mean, you could speak to it, and I know your perspective is a little bit different in your foundation, but we face so many of the same challenges all the time.
Never dull moment, huh?
Oh no, never. Not even a little.
Yeah. So John, you have like a lot of hats, right? That whether it's from your family foundation standpoint and from your professional role. So so share your sense of that.
So it was interesting, Craig, when I got, decided to take the job with the Fibroblast Medullary Cancer, I was the only employee. And I'm used to working in large, like Jim, larger corporations. I had an admin, I had a staff, I had the IT guy, and it's me. But the reason I took it is because I felt at this point in my life, I could make a difference somehow by taking the learning that I had from industry and healthcare and looking at this cancer that's going no place and watching these young kids die, very quickly, was this an interesting challenge? I felt it was the most interesting puzzle I've ever been confronted with. The pieces are there, but no one's putting it together yet, just because it was run by family and friends who just didn't have the time or the knowledge to do that. So the benefit has been that I've learned a lot in the last 8 to 9 years. I mean, so much more than I have even in other parts of my career. I mean, you learn to speak one-on-one with some of the best researchers in the world, and boy, do you get educated from them. B, you have a great idea in terms of how to motivate them. Yes, it's money, but it's also introducing them to patients, and they see, in our case, you've got 12 to 34 years. So let's say the sweet spot's 21. It's a college kid who was the head of the, ultimate Frisbee club. All of a sudden, he comes down with a bellyache, and if it's not diagnosed correctly, the poor kid's dead in a year. So bringing that story to life for some of these researchers and in the industry was, to me, an interesting challenge, but also an important one to do. So again, learning from that perspective. The other thing I think that's motivating when you start, when you actually run a rare cancer foundation, is the idea that you are able to, there is a willing network out there. So there are people who want to learn from each other. And again, since Jim's on here, and even Craig, look at the way the three of us have networked together to learn more, to share resources and things like that. In the bigger organizations, you don't necessarily get that as much. And I'd say there's less silos too, which is really kind of interesting. Academia still has a lot of silos, which is why I kind of, quite frankly, like the younger researchers, because they're more open to it. But I think that's another interesting aspect of it. So again, the plus sizes are, you personally feel like you can make more of a difference because you have no choice. It's you, et cetera. B, you can kind of build your team around that. C is you learn a lot from these great people that are actually researching in terms of, and also industry representatives that are more personal context. So I guess the answer for me is it's a more personal career doing this. And I'd say there's more personal satisfaction, but I'd also say there's a lot more personal stress because the impetus is for us to solve it, right? And boy, if anybody can solve cancer, childhood leukemia, God bless it. There's ways to cure it. Most of the cancers we're dealing with, who knows when we're going to get the answer, right?
Sure. Okay, so
I was just going to say it's a great point John makes. I mean, I feel like sometimes you almost take for granted when you're sitting in a room full of some of the top researchers and doctors in the world, that so I don't know, John, if this happens to you, but every now and then it kind of lands a little bit and you realize how unique it is to have the opportunity to do this on a regular basis, that you get to be a part of these conversations, and most people in the world don't. So it really is fascinating to get to know people like that. I think what we probably don't take for granted, though, is the opportunities, and the so many times the friendships that we make with patients, and the sort of inspiration you take from meeting people and understanding their experiences, even when you've been through your own, just how, amazing and difficult, but also sometimes really great that can be when you see success, and you see people benefiting from the work that's being done. So it's a lot of different pieces.
Thank you. So maybe just to sort of pose one more thing, I've taken a lot of your time here. Can you, I don't know, share a couple of things that you've learned? Just pick a couple of things that just come to mind. I've been trying to have that conversation. I'm always, because I learn from you guys. So tell anybody who's watching, listening, a couple of things you've learned. John?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple. I can go on for a long time. This could be 2 hours, but let me try to talk. I think number one is take risks. In this area here, especially with rare cancers, it's not there's not a path that's really been created beforehand. Be willing to take risk and work with people who are willing to do that. I'll just use one quick example. There's a doctor by the name of Dr. Mark Yarchman from Johns Hopkins, who was a new assistant professor over there. And he had a crazy idea that he actually met us at ASCO GI and said, got a crazy idea about a peptide vaccine that this starts off here, and then we'll use a dual immunotherapy, blah, blah, blah. He goes, nobody wants to fund me. What do you think? I'm like, well, you think it's going to work? He goes, well, here, I'll fund you. And now he's an associate professor with a clinical trial that's working. And he actually will say to us, you made the difference in my career. You were the first ones who actually listened to me, and you were willing to take the risk. So take a risk, take a calculated risk along with it. The other thing I'd say is networking. Boy, have I learned, that's how important that is. I tell my kids this all the time. They don't listen to me, but I think.
Oh, John, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was getting so excited. I hit the wrong button. But you can't do it alone, and you gotta learn that quickly. So you've got to build a network, and quite frankly, enjoy building a network. It's great to learn. Look at the three of us when we met business-wise. I also consider you guys personal friends. So the enjoyment of the network part of it, you're willing to learn from that. It moves things ahead, and quite frankly, from a personal standpoint, it's really satisfying from that standpoint also. I think the last thing part of it is stay positive. It's cancer is not something that's going to be cured tomorrow, and it gets frustrating when we think that we're long ways. But stay around positive people, and also realize that we are making progress. So those are the three things I would take away.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Jim.
I keep saying it. I agree with John. I think the importance of community, the network, but also the community you build is something I've really learned a lot about through my work in this space. Like I said earlier, many people don't really plan to come into this world, or they do so with no experience, and that was certainly the case for me. When I started doing this work, I had no experience in nonprofit work. Certainly wasn't a scientist in any way, although I'm still not, but I understand it better now. So what I learned over the years was just the importance of developing a community and really learning from that community constantly. And I think it's one of the most exciting things about this work, but it's one of the most important too, is that there's no way anybody can do this alone, and none of us know everything. So really finding the right people, whether it's partners who are doing similar work, whether it's the scientists that you partner with, really the list goes on and on and on. But really developing good relationships with those people and learning from them, and not trying to reinvent the wheel, really trying to find common work, find common ideas, and find ways to partner around them. I really think in a small organization in rare cancers and rare diseases, it's absolutely the most important way to make progress and to do so quickly. So that's been a learning that I've taken professionally. It's something I incorporate personally. It's really been the most important thing that I can find as I try to develop this organization and try to develop the most comprehensive and impactful work possible.
Well, you are both doing such important work, and it makes me feel really good that you seem to both take away it's not drudgery. You're taking away a great sense of fulfillment from that. And I think that's the important balance, right? Because this is not easy. As John said, we're not going to cure all these diseases tomorrow, but you obviously both continue to learn and steep yourself in this and take great fulfillment from the work. And I want to just say thank you to both of you for all of the work you do and for being colleagues and friends and for taking your time to talk with me.
Thank you, Craig. I mean, I give you a lot of credit for putting this together. I think people will learn from it. And quite frankly, you're a leader in the community too. So you're a good one to bring us all together. You're a great glue for the community, and I thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And same, Craig. We've worked together for many years now, and it's always a pleasure to do so. And really appreciate you asking us to be a part of what you're putting together here. I think it's going to be great.
Thank you both.